the vibrant city of Atlanta, a simple act of kindness unleashes a storm of prejudice and injustice. Zuri, a compassionate high school student, finds herself at the center of a controversy that exposes deep-seated racial tensions. And if you love your family and want to hear more incredible stories like this one, subscribe to our channel. Zuri's day had started like any other. The final bell at Midtown High School rang, signaling the end of classes. She emerged from the building, her backpack slung over one shoulder, deep in animated conversation with her best friend, Mia. The two girls, inseparable since elementary school, were excitedly discussing their upcoming dance performance. "I still can't believe Mrs. Johnson picked our routine for the spring showcase," Zuri said, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "We've been working on those moves for months." Mia nodded vigorously, her curly hair bouncing with the movement. "I know. And did you see the look on Brittany's face when it was announced? Priceless." As they walked, their path took them through Piedmont Park, a lush green space in the heart of Atlanta. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the winding paths. Joggers and dog walkers passed by, enjoying the pleasant weather. It was then that Zuri's keen eye caught sight of something out of place. On a nearby bench, partially hidden by the shadow of an overhanging branch, sat a designer handbag. Its rich leather gleamed in the sunlight, the gold hardware catching Zuri's attention. "Hey Mia, look at that," Zuri said, nudging her friend and pointing towards the bench. Someone must have forgotten their bag. Curiosity piqued, Zuri approached the bench, Mia following close behind. The bag was even more luxurious up close, clearly expensive and well-crafted. Zuri hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the clasp. "Should we open it?" she asked, glancing at Mia. Mia shrugged. "We need to find out who it belongs to, right? There might be some ID inside." Taking a deep breath, Zuri carefully opened the bag. Inside, she found a wallet, some makeup, and a sleek smartphone. She gingerly removed the wallet, acutely aware that she was handling someone else's personal belongings. "Look," she said, showing Mia a driver's license she found inside. "It belongs to someone named Catherine Hartley." As they examined the contents, Zuri's mind raced. She knew the right thing to do was to return the bag to its owner, but a small part of her couldn't help but marvel at the value of what she held in her hands. The bag alone probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. "We should call her," Zuri decided, reaching for the phone. "She's probably worried sick about losing all this." Mia nodded in agreement, and Zuri dialed the number listed on one of the business cards in the wallet. After a few rings, a crisp, authoritative voice answered. "Hello? Who is this?" Zuri swallowed nervously. "Hi, is this Catherine Hartley? My name is Zuri Johnson. I found your bag in Piedmont Park, and I wanted to return it to you." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh of relief. "Oh, thank goodness. I've been looking everywhere for it. Where are you now?" Zuri gave Catherine their location in the park, and they agreed to meet at Catherine's home to return the bag. As she ended the call, Zuri felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She was doing the right thing, but something about Catherine's tone left her feeling slightly uneasy. "Come on," she said to Mia, gathering up the bag. "Let's go return this. It's on our way home anyway." As they set off towards the address Catherine had given them, Zuri couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. She told herself it was just nerves, that she was doing a good deed. Little did she know that this simple act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would challenge her in ways she never expected. Zuri and Mia arrived at the address Catherine had provided, their eyes widening as they took in the sight before them. The house, or rather, mansion, stood imposingly behind wrought iron gates, its manicured lawns stretching out in all directions. The Georgian-style architecture spoke of old money and privilege, a stark contrast to the modest apartment complex Zuri called home. "Whoa," Mia whispered, nudging Zuri. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Zuri double-checked the address on her phone and nodded. "This is it." She pressed the intercom button at the gate, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. After a brief exchange, the gate swung open silently. Zuri and Mia walked up the long driveway, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. As they approached the front door, it opened, revealing a woman in her mid-40s with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and an outfit that screamed designer labels. "You must be Zuri," the woman said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm Catherine. Please come in." Zuri stepped inside, Mia trailing behind her. The interior of the house was just as impressive as the exterior, with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that looked like it belonged in a museum. "I found your bag in the park," Zuri said, holding it out. "Everything should still be inside." Catherine took the bag, her eyes scanning Zuri from head to toe. "Thank you," she said, her tone measured. "That was very honest of you." Zuri. There was something in the way Catherine said it that made Zuri's skin prickle. She stood straighter, suddenly aware of her worn sneakers and the small hole in the sleeve of her sweater. "Of course," Zuri replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Anyone would have done the same. Catherine's eyebrow arched slightly. "Would they?" She gestured towards the living room. "Please, sit down. I'd like to ask you a few questions if you don't mind." Zuri and Mia exchanged a glance before settling onto an expensive-looking sofa. Catherine perched on an armchair across from them, her posture rigid. "So, Zuri," Catherine began, her eyes never leaving the young girl's face. "Tell me about yourself. Where do you go to school?" "Midtown High," Zuri answered, fighting the urge to fidget under Catherine's intense gaze. "Ah, a public school," Catherine nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "And your parents? What do they do?" Zuri felt a flicker of annoyance at the interrogation, but pushed it down. "My mom's a nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital. She works really hard." "I see," Catherine said, her tone neutral. "And your father?" Zuri tensed. "He's not in the picture." A look passed over Catherine's face. Was it pity or something else? Zuri couldn't quite tell. "That must be difficult," Catherine said, though her words lacked genuine sympathy. "Now, about the bag. You say you just happened to find it in the park?" The implication in Catherine's question was clear, and Zuri felt a surge of indignation. "Yes," she said firmly. "It was just sitting there on a bench. We opened it to find your ID so we could return it." Catherine nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Zuri's face. "And you didn't take anything from it?" The room fell silent. Mia shifted uncomfortably beside Zuri, who felt as if all the air had been sucked out of her lungs. She stared at Catherine in disbelief, the woman's suspicion hitting her like a physical blow. "No," Zuri said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "We didn't take anything. We just wanted to do the right thing." Catherine seemed to realize she'd overstepped. Her expression softened slightly, but the damage was done. "Of course," she said, her tone artificially light. "I appreciate your honesty. Not everyone would have returned it." Zuri stood up abruptly, unable to bear another minute in the suffocating atmosphere of judgment and suspicion. "We should go," she said, glancing at Mia, who quickly got to her feet as well. As they made their way to the door, Catherine called out, "Wait." She disappeared into another room and returned with an envelope. "Here," she said, holding it out to Zuri. "A reward for your honesty." Zuri looked at the envelope, then back at Catherine. In that moment, she saw clearly the assumptions and prejudices that had colored their entire interaction. With a deep breath, she shook her head. "No, thank you," she said firmly. I don't want a reward for doing the right thing." Without waiting for a response, Zuri turned and walked out the door, Mia right behind her. As they made their way down the driveway, Zuri's mind raced. She had done nothing wrong, yet she felt humiliated, angry, and deeply hurt. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something ugly, exposing prejudices that Zuri had hoped were a thing of the past. As they reached the street, Zuri realized that returning the bag wasn't the end of something, but the beginning. Little did she know how this encounter would ripple out, affecting not just her life, but the lives of many others in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The sun had long since set, when a sharp knock at the door pierced the evening calm of the Johnson household. Zuri, who had been trying to focus on her homework, but finding her mind constantly drifting back to the uncomfortable encounter with Catherine, looked up in surprise. Her mother, Amara, who had just returned from her shift at the hospital, went to answer. As soon as the door opened, Zuri heard unfamiliar voices, male, authoritative, and decidedly unwelcome. Her heart began to race as she recognized the tone. Police officers. "Good evening, ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice carrying easily through the small apartment. "We're here to speak with Zuri Johnson. Is she home?" Zuri froze, her pencil hovering above her notebook. What could the police possibly want with her? "Yes, she's here," Amara replied, her voice tense. "May I ask what this is about?" There was a pause and then, "We've received a complaint about a possible theft. We just need to ask her a few questions." The word theft hit Zuri like a physical blow. She knew immediately what this was about, and the realization made her feel sick to her stomach. Catherine had called the police on her. Amara called out, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of worry. "Zuri, honey, can you come here please?" On shaky legs, Zuri made her way to the front door. Two officers stood in the hallway, their expressions impassive as they took in the sight of the teenage girl before them. "Are you Zuri Johnson?" the taller of the two asked. Zuri nodded, finding her voice. "Yes, sir. What's this about?" The officer's gaze hardened slightly. "We received a call from a Catherine Hartley. She claims that earlier today, you returned a bag to her that you claim to have found in the park. Is this correct?" "Yes," Zuri replied, her confusion and fear giving way to indignation. "I found her bag and returned it. I didn't take anything from it." The second officer stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his belt, uncomfortably close to his holster. "Ms. Hartley reports that some items appear to be missing from her bag. Can you explain that?" Zuri felt as if the floor was tilting beneath her feet. "What? No, that's impossible. I didn't take anything. I just wanted to return her property." Amara, who had been listening with growing alarm, moved to stand beside her daughter. "Officers, there must be some mistake. Zuri would never steal anything. She's a good girl." The first officer's eyes flicked dismissively over Amara before returning to Zuri. "Ma'am, we're just following up on a complaint. Now, Zuri, where were you between 3:30 and 4 p.m. today?" As Zuri began to explain about finding the bag in the park with Mia, she could see the skepticism in the officer's eyes. They weren't really listening to her. They had already made up their minds. "And you expect us to believe that you just happened to find an expensive designer bag and didn't take anything from it?" the second officer asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. Zuri felt tears of frustration pricking at her eyes. "It's the truth. I was raised better than that. I would never steal." Amara, her fatigue from her long shift at the hospital giving way to protective anger, stepped in front of Zuri. "That's enough. My daughter has told you what happened. Unless you have actual evidence of wrongdoing, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The officers exchanged a look, clearly not used to being challenged. "Ma'am, interfering with a police investigation is a serious offense," the first officer warned. "So is harassing a minor without probable cause," Amara shot back, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze steady. You have no warrant, no evidence, and no right to interrogate my daughter like this. Now, please leave." For a tense moment, it seemed like the officers might push back. But then, perhaps realizing they were on shaky ground, they backed down. "We'll be following up on this," the taller officer said, his tone a clear warning. "Don't leave town." As the door closed behind the retreating officers, Zuri felt her legs give way. She sank to the floor, tears flowing freely now. Amara knelt beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "It's okay, baby," Amara murmured, stroking Zuri's hair. "I believe you. We'll figure this out." But as Zuri clung to her mother, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The look in the officers' eyes, the ease with which they had dismissed her truth, it spoke to something deeper, something systemic. For the first time in her young life, Zuri truly understood what it meant to be judged not by her character, but by the color of her skin. As the night wore on, Zuri's phone buzzed with messages from Mia, who had heard about the police visit through the neighborhood grapevine. Tomorrow, they would have to face the fallout at school. But for now, in the quiet of their small apartment, Zuri and Amara held each other, drawing strength for the battle that lay ahead. The following day, tension hung thick in the air as Zuri arrived at Midtown High. Whispers and stares followed her through the hallways, the news of the police visit having spread like wildfire. Mia was waiting for her at her locker, concern etched across her face. "Zuri, I heard what happened," Mia said, pulling her friend into a tight hug. "This is so messed up. We have to do something." Zuri nodded, her eyes tired but determined. "I know, but what can we do? It's our word against Catherine's, and clearly, the police are more inclined to believe her." As they walked to class, Mia's brow furrowed in thought. Suddenly, her eyes lit up. "Social media," she exclaimed. "We can use it to tell your side of the story, get people to see the truth." Initially hesitant, Zuri agreed. During lunch, they huddled over Mia's phone, crafting a post that detailed the events of the past day. Mia, known for her way with words, helped Zuri strike a balance between factual reporting and emotional appeal. They ended the post with a newly created hashtag, Justice for Zuri. "There," Mia said, hitting post with a flourish. "Now we wait." They didn't have to wait long. By the end of the school day, the post had gone viral. Students, teachers, and even strangers from across Atlanta were sharing Zuri's story, expressing outrage at the blatant racial profiling she had experienced. As Zuri walked home that afternoon, her phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Among the flood of supportive messages, one caught her eye, a direct message from a local activist named Marcus Taylor. "Zuri," the message read, "your story resonates with so many in our community. We're organizing a peaceful protest this weekend to raise awareness about racial profiling. Would you be willing to speak?" Zuri's heart raced as she read the message. Public speaking had never been her forte, but she knew this was bigger than her personal comfort. With trembling fingers, she typed out a response. "Yes, I'll do it." When Zuri arrived home, she found her mother in an animated discussion with their neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. "Zuri mija," Mrs. Rodriguez called out, "We've been talking about what happened. This isn't right, and we're not going to stand for it." Amara nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of anger and pride. "The whole building is talking about it. People are angry, but more importantly, they're ready to act." Over the next few days, Zuri watched in awe as her community rallied around her. The protest, initially planned as a small gathering, grew into a major event. Local businesses donated supplies, artists created powerful posters, and volunteers coordinated logistics. The night before the protest, Zuri sat at her desk, staring at the blank page before her. She had to write her speech, but the words wouldn't come. How could she encapsulate everything she was feeling? The hurt, the anger, but also the overwhelming gratitude for the support she'd received. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Amara entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. "How's it going, baby?" she asked, setting one mug beside Zuri. Zuri sighed, gesturing at the empty page. "I don't know what to say, Mom. What if I mess up? What if I let everyone down?" Amara pulled up a chair, sitting beside her daughter. "Zuri, look at me," she said gently. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest. Tell your truth. That's more than enough." Encouraged by her mother's words, Zuri began to write. As the words flowed, she felt a sense of purpose settling over her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, every voice that had been silenced. The next morning, as Zuri stood before the gathered crowd, her nervousness melted away. She saw familiar faces, Mia, her teachers, neighbors, mixed with strangers who had come to show their support. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "I stand here today not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been judged, not by the content of their character, but by the color of their skin." As Zuri's voice rang out, clear and strong, a ripple of energy passed through the crowd. Signs were raised. Voices joined in solidarity, and a movement was born. In that moment, Zuri realized that what had started as a personal injustice had become a catalyst for change. The protest marked a turning point, not just for Zuri, but for the entire community. It was a powerful reminder that when people unite against injustice, their collective voice cannot be ignored. As the day drew to a close, Zuri felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The road ahead would be challenging, but she was no longer walking it alone. A community had risen, ready to fight for justice, equality, and the right to be seen for who they truly were. As the protest's energy continued to reverberate through the community, Zuri found herself thrust into a whirlwind of activity. Interviews, meetings with community leaders, and strategy sessions filled her days. Yet, in the quiet moments between these engagements, memories she had long suppressed began to surface. One evening, as Zuri sat on her bed, scrolling through the flood of supportive messages on her phone, a particular comment caught her eye. It praised her eloquence, expressing surprise at how well-spoken she was. The seemingly innocuous compliment hit Zuri like a punch to the gut, triggering a cascade of memories. Suddenly, she was back in her 7th grade English class. Ms. Thompson, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, was handing back essays. When she reached Zuri's desk, she paused, a look of suspicion clouding her features. "Zuri," Ms. Thompson had said, her voice low but sharp, "I'd like to speak with you after class about your essay." Young Zuri had nodded, confused but eager to hear her teacher's feedback. When the bell rang and the other students filed out, she approached Ms. Thompson's desk with anticipation. "This essay," Ms. Thompson began, holding up Zuri's paper, "it's quite good, perhaps too good. Are you sure you wrote this yourself?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Zuri felt her cheeks burn with a mix of shame and indignation. "Yes, Ms. Thompson," she had replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I worked really hard on it." Ms. Thompson's eyes had narrowed, unconvinced. "Well, I'll be keeping a close eye on your work from now on. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." The memory faded, leaving Zuri feeling drained. She realized now what she couldn't articulate then, the subtle racism inherent in Ms. Thompson's assumption that a young black girl couldn't possibly have written a high-quality essay. Another memory surfaced, this time from her freshman year of high school. During a group project in biology class, Zuri had excitedly shared her idea for their presentation. The group had fallen silent, exchanging glances. "That's actually a good idea," Tyler, one of her groupmates, had said, his tone betraying his surprise. "I didn't expect that from you, Zuri." At the time, Zuri had brushed off the comment, too focused on the project to dwell on it. Now, she recognized it for what it was, another microaggression, another instance where her intelligence was underestimated due to her race. These memories, once pushed to the recesses of her mind, now came into sharp focus. Zuri realized that what she had experienced with Catherine and the police wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of subtle and not so subtle racism. She thought about all the times she had been followed in stores, the suspicious glances from security guards, the way some teachers seemed surprised when she excelled in class. Each incident, seemingly small on its own, had contributed to a larger pattern of discrimination and prejudice. As these realizations washed over her, Zuri felt a complex mix of emotions. There was anger at the injustice she had faced, sadness for the innocence she had lost, but also a growing determination. She understood now that her fight wasn't just about one incident with a lost bag. It was about challenging the systemic racism that permeated every aspect of society. Wiping away tears she hadn't realized she'd shed, Zuri reached for her journal. She began to write, pouring out her experiences, her frustrations, and her hopes for change. As her pen flew across the page, she felt a sense of catharsis, but also of purpose. These stories, her stories, needed to be told. They were not just her experiences, but the experiences of countless others who had faced similar prejudices and microaggressions. By sharing them, she could help others recognize and confront the subtle racism in their own lives. As the night wore on, Zuri's writing transformed from personal reflection to a call to action. She began drafting ideas for workshops, awareness campaigns, and educational programs. She envisioned creating safe spaces where people could share their experiences and learn from one another. When Amara checked on her daughter in the early hours of the morning, she found Zuri asleep at her desk, pen still in hand, surrounded by pages filled with plans and ideas. Smiling softly, Amara gently tucked a blanket around Zuri's shoulders. In her sleep, Zuri's face was peaceful, but there was a new strength in her features. The strength of someone who had confronted painful truths and emerged more determined than ever. The journey ahead would be challenging, but Zuri was ready. She had found her voice, and she intended to use it not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced by prejudice and discrimination. As dawn broke over Atlanta, it seemed to herald not just a new day, but a new chapter in Zuri's life, one of activism, education, and unwavering commitment to justice. The day of the public hearing arrived, bringing with it a mixture of nervous energy and determination. Zuri, accompanied by her mother Amara and best friend Mia, made their way to the city hall. The building's imposing architecture seemed to loom over them, a physical manifestation of the systemic power they were challenging. As they approached the entrance, Zuri took a deep breath, steadying herself. The weight of what she was about to do pressed heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was giving voice to countless others who had faced similar injustices. Inside, the hearing room was already buzzing with activity. Community members, activists, and curious onlookers filled the seats. At the front, a panel of city officials sat behind a long table, their expressions a mix of neutrality and subtle discomfort. Zuri, Amara, and Mia found seats near the front. As they settled in, Zuri scanned the room, noting the diversity of the crowd. There were faces of all colors, ages, and backgrounds, a true representation of Atlanta's multicultural community. The sight bolstered her courage. The hearing began with formalities, introductions, statements of purpose, and procedural explanations. Zuri listened intently, her heart racing as she waited for her turn to speak. Finally, her name was called. With a reassuring squeeze of her hand from both Amara and Mia, Zuri stood and made her way to the podium. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the young woman who had become the face of this movement. Zuri cleared her throat and began to speak, her voice initially soft, but growing stronger with each word. "Good morning. My name is Zuri Johnson, and I'm here today to share my story. A story that, unfortunately, is all too common for people who look like me." She recounted the events of that fateful day, finding Catherine's bag, the tense interaction at the mansion, and the humiliating visit from the police. As she spoke, she could see the impact her words were having. Some nodded in understanding, others looked shocked, and a few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Zuri didn't stop there. Drawing on the reflections and realizations she'd had over the past weeks, she broadened her testimony. "What happened to me that day wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of years of subtle, and not so subtle, racism that permeates our society." She shared her experiences of microaggressions, of being underestimated and overlooked. She spoke of the constant pressure to prove herself, to be twice as good, just to be considered equal. Her voice cracked with emotion as she described the toll this takes on a person's psyche, on their sense of self-worth. "But I'm not here just to talk about problems," Zuri continued, her voice gaining strength. "I'm here to talk about solutions, about the need for better training for our police officers, for programs that address implicit bias in our schools and workplaces, for a commitment to true equality in every aspect of our community." As she concluded her testimony, Zuri looked out at the sea of faces before her. Some were moved to tears, others wore expressions of grim determination. Even the panel of officials seemed affected, their earlier neutrality replaced by thoughtful consideration. "Thank you for listening to my story," Zuri said. "But more importantly, thank you for being willing to act, because that's what we need now. Action. Real, meaningful change that ensures no one else has to go through what I did. Together, we can make Atlanta a model of justice and equality for the entire nation." As Zuri stepped away from the podium, the room erupted in applause. She made her way back to her seat, where Amara enveloped her in a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. Mia beamed with pride, giving Zuri a thumbs up. The hearing continued, with others stepping forward to share their own experiences and perspectives. Each story added to the growing narrative of a community united in its demand for change. As the session drew to a close, Zuri felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had done it, she had spoken her truth, and people had listened. But she knew this was just the beginning. The real work of creating change was still ahead. Leaving the city hall, Zuri was approached by reporters eager for comments and community members offering words of support and encouragement. In that moment, surrounded by the energy and determination of her community, Zuri felt a surge of hope. They had taken an important step today, and together, they would keep moving forward. A week after the public hearing, Zuri received an unexpected notification. Catherine Hartley had requested a meeting. The message, delivered through her lawyer, expressed a desire to clear the air and address recent events. Zuri's initial reaction was a mixture of surprise and apprehension. After discussing it with her mother and seeking advice from Marcus, the community activist who had become a mentor to her, Zuri decided to accept the meeting. It was arranged to take place at a neutral location, a conference room in a downtown office building. On the day of the meeting, Zuri arrived with her mother and Marcus. The sterile environment of the conference room did little to ease the tension that hung in the air. Catherine was already there, accompanied by her lawyer, a stern-looking man in an expensive suit. As Zuri entered the room, she couldn't help but notice how different Catherine looked from their first encounter. The polished, confident woman seemed diminished somehow, her posture less rigid, her eyes showing a hint of, was it remorse? "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Catherine began, her voice lacking its previous authoritative tone. I believe we have much to discuss." Zuri nodded, taking a seat across from Catherine. "Yes, we do," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. Catherine took a deep breath before continuing. "First and foremost, I want to apologize for my actions that day. My behavior was inexcusable, and the consequences of my unfounded suspicions have been far-reaching." Zuri listened, her face a mask of careful neutrality. She had prepared herself for this moment, determined not to let her emotions override her purpose. "I've been following the news," Catherine continued. "I've seen the protests, read about the hearing. I never intended for things to escalate the way they did." "Intentions don't negate impact," Zuri responded, her voice quiet but firm. "Your actions didn't just affect me. They reinforced a system that routinely discriminates against people of color." Catherine flinched at Zuri's words but nodded. "You're right. I've done a lot of soul-searching these past weeks. I've had to confront my own biases I didn't even realize I had." As the conversation progressed, Zuri found herself opening up about her experiences, not just from that day, but from throughout her life. She spoke about the microaggressions, the constant feeling of being judged, the exhaustion of always having to prove herself. To her surprise, Catherine listened intently, her eyes growing wider with each revelation. It was clear that this was the first time she had truly considered the reality of life as a person of color in America. I had no idea," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've lived in such a bubble. I thought I was open-minded, but I see now how narrow my perspective has been." As the meeting continued, the conversation shifted from personal experiences to broader societal issues. Catherine, to Zuri's surprise, began asking questions, genuine, thoughtful questions about racial inequality and how to address it. "I want to make this right," Catherine said, her voice filled with determination. "Not just with you, Zuri, but in a broader sense. What can I do? How can I help?" Zuri exchanged glances with her mother and Marcus. This was an unexpected turn, but one that could potentially lead to real change. "Education is key," Zuri began. "Using your influence to promote diversity and inclusion initiatives, supporting organizations that fight for racial justice." As they brainstormed ideas, Zuri felt a shift in the room's energy. What had started as a tense confrontation was evolving into something more collaborative, more hopeful. By the end of the meeting, concrete plans had been made. Catherine committed to using her resources and connections to support Zuri's initiatives. She also agreed to undergo implicit bias training and to encourage her peers to do the same. As they prepared to leave, Catherine turned to Zuri one last time. "Thank you," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to learn and grow. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm committed to doing better." Zuri nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Real change takes time and consistent effort." As they left the building, Zuri felt a sense of cautious optimism. The meeting hadn't erased the past, but it had opened a door to a potentially better future. It was a reminder that change was possible, even in the most unexpected places. Walking home with her mother and Marcus, Zuri realized that this encounter had reinforced her commitment to her cause. The fight for justice and equality was far from over, but today had shown that minds could be opened, perspectives could be shifted. And in that realization, Zuri found renewed strength for the journey ahead. In the weeks following their meeting, Zuri watched with cautious optimism as Catherine began to make good on her promises. The transformation was gradual but noticeable, like watching a flower slowly unfurl its petals in the warmth of the sun. Catherine's first step was to enroll in an intensive implicit bias training program. She didn't just attend, she threw herself into the coursework with a fervor that surprised even the facilitators. Zuri received updates from Catherine, detailing her revelations and the uncomfortable truths she was confronting about herself and her upbringing. "I never realized how much privilege I've had," Catherine wrote in one email. "It's like I've been walking through life with blinders on, and now they're finally coming off. It's overwhelming, but necessary." True to her word, Catherine began leveraging her considerable influence in Atlanta's high society. She organized a fundraiser for local organizations working on racial justice initiatives, using her connections to ensure a high-profile turnout. The event raised a substantial amount, but more importantly, it opened up conversations in circles that had long been silent on these issues. Zuri was invited to speak at the fundraiser. As she stood at the podium, facing a sea of faces that once would have intimidated her, she felt a surge of pride. Her voice, strong and clear, carried her message to those who needed to hear it most. "Change begins with acknowledgement," Zuri said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Acknowledgement of our biases, of the systemic inequalities that persist in our society. But it doesn't end there. Real change requires action, commitment, and a willingness to be uncomfortable." As she spoke, Zuri noticed Catherine in the audience, nodding along, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It was a far cry from the woman who had once looked at her with suspicion and disdain. Following the fundraiser, Catherine approached Zuri with another proposal. She wanted to start a mentorship program, pairing successful professionals with promising students from underserved communities. Catherine asked for Zuri's input on the program's structure and implementation. "I want to do this right," Catherine explained, her voice filled with determination. "I don't want it to be just another feel-good initiative that doesn't create real change. I need your perspective to make sure it's truly beneficial." Zuri was touched by Catherine's sincerity. Together, they worked on developing the program, with Zuri providing insights that Catherine would have never considered on her own. It was a collaboration that neither of them could have imagined just a few months ago. As the mentorship program took shape, Catherine's transformation became more evident. She began speaking out against racial injustices in her social circles, challenging long-held beliefs and confronting friends when they made insensitive comments. It wasn't always easy. She lost some friends along the way, but Catherine remained committed to her newfound path. One afternoon, as Zuri and Catherine were leaving a planning meeting for the mentorship program, they ran into a group of Catherine's old friends. The women eyed Zuri warily, their discomfort palpable. "Catherine," one of them said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we've missed you at our gatherings. Are you still involved with all this?" Catherine straightened her spine, meeting her friend's gaze directly. "Yes, I am," she replied firmly, "and I hope that one day you'll join me in this important work." As the women walked away, muttering among themselves, Catherine turned to Zuri with a rueful smile. "I used to be just like them," she admitted. "It's not easy changing a lifetime of conditioning, but I'm trying. Every day, I'm trying." Zuri nodded, feeling a warmth of respect for Catherine's efforts. "That's all any of us can do," she said softly. "Keep trying, keep learning, keep growing." As they parted ways that day, Zuri reflected on the journey they had both undergone. Catherine's redemption wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was an ongoing process, filled with challenges and setbacks. But it was real, and it was making a tangible difference in their community. For Zuri, watching Catherine's transformation reinforced her belief in the power of education and open dialogue. It reminded her that change was possible, even in the most unlikely places. And it gave her hope for the future, a future where understanding and empathy could bridge the divides that had long seemed insurmountable. As she walked home, Zuri felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work was far from over, but every step forward, every mind opened, was a victory worth celebrating. and in Catherine's journey from adversary to ally, Zuri saw a microcosm of the change she hoped to see in the world at large. The story of Zuri and Catherine's unexpected alliance spread quickly through Atlanta, capturing the attention of local media and sparking conversations across the city. What had begun as a personal conflict had evolved into a powerful narrative of transformation and community unity. As news outlets picked up the story, Zuri found herself thrust into the spotlight once again. This time, however, the narrative was different. Instead of focusing solely on the initial incident of racial profiling, reporters were eager to explore the journey of reconciliation and the positive changes it had inspired. One crisp autumn morning, Zuri sat for an interview with a respected local journalist. The reporter, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, leaned forward, her pen poised over her notepad. "Zuri," she began, "your story has captivated our city. How do you feel about the way things have unfolded?" Zuri took a moment to gather her thoughts. "It's been a whirlwind," she admitted. "But what stands out to me most is how this experience has brought our community together. It's shown us that change is possible when we're willing to have difficult conversations and do the hard work of addressing our biases." The journalist nodded, scribbling furiously. "And what about Catherine? How has your relationship evolved?" "Catherine's journey has been remarkable," Zuri replied, choosing her words carefully. "Her willingness to confront her own biases and use her privilege to effect change has been inspiring, but it's important to remember that this isn't just about two individuals. It's about a community coming together to address systemic issues." As the interview concluded, Zuri felt a sense of responsibility weighing on her shoulders. She knew that the increased attention brought both opportunities and challenges. How could they harness this momentum to create lasting change? The answer came in the form of a community-wide initiative. Inspired by Zuri and Catherine's story, local leaders, activists, and concerned citizens came together to organize a series of events aimed at promoting understanding and fostering inclusive practices across Atlanta. The centerpiece of this initiative was a day-long festival celebrating diversity and unity. Held in Piedmont Park, the very place where Zuri had found Catherine's bag, the event drew thousands of attendees from all walks of life. As Zuri walked through the festival grounds, she was overwhelmed by the sight. Colorful booths lined the pathways, each representing a different cultural group or social justice organization. The air was filled with the sounds of various languages and music styles, the aroma of diverse cuisines wafting on the breeze. At the main stage, a series of speakers shared their experiences and visions for a more inclusive Atlanta. Zuri watched with pride as her mother, Amara, took the podium to discuss the importance of diversity in healthcare. Catherine followed, speaking candidly about her journey of self-reflection and the need for those in positions of privilege to actively work towards equity. Throughout the day, Zuri participated in workshops and panel discussions, sharing her insights and learning from others. She was particularly moved by a session on intersectionality, which highlighted the complex ways in which different forms of discrimination overlap and compound each other. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Zuri found a quiet moment to reflect. She watched as people from different backgrounds mingled, engaged in animated conversations and shared meals together. It wasn't perfect. She could still see moments of awkwardness and misunderstanding, but it was progress. It happens in the everyday choices we make to challenge our own biases and stand up for what's right. As applause erupted, Zuri felt a sense of both accomplishment and anticipation. They had taken important steps, but the journey towards true equality and justice was ongoing. Yet, looking at the united community before her, Zuri knew they were on the right path. The festival may have been ending, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter for Atlanta, one of increased awareness, active engagement, and a shared commitment to creating a more just and inclusive community for all. As the Community Unity Festival wound down, the energy of change and hope still buzzing in the air. An unexpected turn of events was about to unfold. Zuri, exhausted but exhilarated from the day's events, was approached by a man she didn't recognize. He introduced himself as James Harrington, an investigative reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "Zuri," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I have information that I think you need to hear. It's about Catherine Hartley." Intrigued and slightly wary, Zuri agreed to speak with him in a quiet corner of the park. What James revealed next would shake the foundations of everything Zuri thought she knew about Catherine and the events of the past few months. "I've been doing some digging," James began, "and I've uncovered something quite extraordinary about Ms. Hartley. She's not just a wealthy socialite. For years, she's been a silent but significant donor to numerous social justice causes and organizations fighting against racial discrimination." Zuri's mind reeled. "What? But how? Why didn't she say anything?" James continued, "It seems Ms. Hartley has been operating under various pseudonyms to keep her contributions anonymous. I've traced substantial donations to everything from scholarship funds for underprivileged youth to legal defense funds for victims of racial profiling." As James laid out the evidence, bank records, testimonies from organization leaders, and a paper trail that stretched back nearly a decade, Zuri felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. The Catherine she thought she knew, the woman who had treated her with suspicion and called the police, suddenly seemed like a different person entirely. "But why?" Zuri asked, struggling to reconcile this new information with her experiences. "Why would she act the way she did if she's been supporting these causes all along?" James shook his head. "That's the part I haven't figured out yet, but I thought you should know before this story breaks. It's going to change a lot of people's perceptions." As James left to prepare his article for publication, Zuri sat in stunned silence, trying to process this revelation. She realized she needed to speak with Catherine directly. The next morning, Zuri requested an urgent meeting with Catherine. When they met at a small cafe, Catherine's face was a mask of apprehension and resignation. "You know, don't you?" Catherine said quietly, as Zuri sat down. Zuri nodded. "I think it's time you explained everything, Catherine, the real story." Taking a deep breath, Catherine began to speak. She revealed that her philanthropic work had been inspired by a painful incident in her past. Her brother had been wrongly convicted of a crime due to racial profiling and spent years in prison before being exonerated. This experience had opened her eyes to the realities of systemic racism, but fear of ostracism from her social circle had kept her silent. "The day I met you, Zuri," Catherine explained, her voice thick with emotion, "I was battling my own demons. I had just received news that a major donation I had made anonymously had been misused by the organization. I was angry, disillusioned, and I let my worst instincts take over. I'm deeply ashamed of how I acted." Zuri listened, her mind racing to process this new information. "But why didn't you tell me all this when we met to clear the air?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I was a coward," she admitted. "I thought if I just focused on making amends, on doing better, it would be enough. But I see now that true change requires complete honesty." As their conversation continued, Zuri began to see the complex layers of Catherine's character. A woman torn between her privileged upbringing and her secret fight for justice. Someone who had made grave mistakes, but was genuinely committed to making things right. In the days that followed, as James Harrington's article hit the newsstands, Atlanta was abuzz with this latest development. The revelation of Catherine's secret philanthropy added a new dimension to the ongoing dialogue about race and privilege in the city. For Zuri, this twist brought both challenges and opportunities. It complicated the narrative she had been sharing, but also opened up new avenues for discussion about the complexities of addressing systemic racism. In a bold move, Zuri decided to invite Catherine to join her in a series of public forums. Together, They would share their story, the full story, and use it as a launching point for deeper conversations about race, responsibility, and the sometimes messy process of personal and societal change. As they prepared for their first joint appearance, Zuri reflected on the unpredictable journey that had brought them to this point. She realized that real change was rarely straightforward or easy. It was complex, often uncomfortable, and full of surprises. But as she looked at Catherine, no longer an adversary or even just an ally, but a partner in this ongoing work, Zuri felt a renewed sense of hope. Their story, with all its twists and turns, was a testament to the power of honesty, perseverance, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Together, they stepped onto the stage, ready to share their story and continue the vital work of building a more just and equitable community. The journey was far from over, but with each step, they were moving closer to the change they wished to see in the world.